Welcome back. I've got John Gronen on the line. John, how are you?
Very good, Michael. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being on the show. Really looking forward to this conversation as we were chatting in the pre-show. What we're talking about is something that, quite frankly, it's kind of alarming that it's almost been 4 decades since they started talking about paper and reducing the usage of paper and offices and finance and things like that. So that's right up your wheelhouse. So why don't you share a little bit about you, and then we'll jump into the conversation.
Okay, I'm a CFO at a company called Yooz. Yooz is an AP automation and payments company. So spanning all kinds of industry verticals, heavy in construction, automotive, like almost anything. So the product really seeks to automate that workflow of receiving an invoice, processing it, getting it coded in an accounting system, and getting it paid. Prior to that, I've done two other stints in payments companies and then kind of a broad background before that in finance and operations.
Yeah, it's one of those things that with finance and automating things, and even now with AI, we're seeing so many different options and tools available that will automate so much. And, obviously your organization has been doing a great job with, leveraging all the tools that are available in your own system to really streamline some things. Because when I think of the the quote unquote paper trail, as we like to call it. Where's this invoice and how does it get approved and all that? And you think about it, and a piece of paper that gets mailed. So there's, the cost and all of that is just insane. And I remember this. This is a calculation in a non-for-profit that I was a part of. Almost, well, it's been 15 years ago now, and we were able to calculate, how much it cost us to generate a check, and it was
Yeah.
$32
Yeah.
for each check, and we issued close to 700 checks a month. So do the math. We're a nonprofit,
Yeah.
and you're, spending that kind of money just on time and effort and things like that. So, and the systems back then weren't anywhere near as advanced as they are now. But even back then, there were ways to streamline some things and leverage technology that we did have to come up with approval processes where we didn't have to have this physical invoice to process through the system, get approved, and then remit payment and you know electronic transfer. All that stuff existed 15 years ago,
Oh,
uh,
yeah.
but but fast forward to now, it certainly exists. Come on, we there's systems out there. I'm not going to name any because they don't sponsor the show, and I don't want to name any potential competition of yours either. But uh, the systems are there. They
Yeah.
exist, and yet we cling on to paper like it's our security blanket. And finance people for sure. Legal I get, but
Yeah.
even then, there's systems available where they don't have to do it as much. But why do you think that's the case? Why do you think that there's this tight hold on using paper when the systems and processes have been automated so much to the point where we don't have to print things anymore?
I think people get stuck in kind of two areas. One is, we become creatures of habit. We've always had paper, and so we're used to processing that paper, and it's just comfortable. And I think there's the second piece to that is kind of a fear of the unknown and what is automation really going to do to my organization, and does it work, and is it too expensive? And, most of the automation softwares that are out there are pretty reasonably priced, and the savings that you get come across the board. So it's not just in raw dollar savings. There's also a satisfaction component that goes along with the employee, where the employee gets freed up to work on other things and they're more satisfied with the job. They're not just processing paper invoices and scanning it and coding it and setting it up and printing a check. You hit on a couple of things in the lead in. You know, Even the most recent surveys, the cost of printing a check for most organizations ranges between about $7 and about $13. So it really hasn't changed too much from then. It's come down a little bit, Two companies ago, I was at a payments company called VPay that did payments in the insurance space. And we had several customers that looked at their own internal costs to just generate a check. Like, forget the invoice and the processing of that piece, just the check itself on the payment side. And it ranged between about $6 and $9. So that survey is pretty close. And that's your all-in cost. So if you look at automating the process from the ingestion of an invoice all the way through to the payment, you're saving $20-$30 per invoice at least. And then you have the component of your employees are happier, it frees up time. Automation can take the average for processing an invoice ranges between about 10 and 12 minutes. So with an automation that is ingesting the invoice into an inbox, automatically using AI and machine learning to kind of code that invoice based on what's the line items on the invoice, and so AI will pull off your date and your invoice number and the amount and whatever the SKU is or the item is, and then code that for you. The machine learning uses how it's done it in the past to auto code it and take a pretty good guess at where it should be coded, and then your AP clerk is just looking at it to make sure, yes, it's in the right department, the right account, the right amount, everything else. And so you take 10 to 12 minutes down to 1 to 2 minutes. That cost savings, again, you just hit on it with the cost of checks. Apply that to time. That 8 minutes per invoice over 100 invoices is 800 minutes. You're freeing up of that employee's time. So as you scale up a business and you have more and more invoices, you may not need to add another person because you now have some capacity, or you can use that time from that individual to do something more value added, like cost analysis or vendor analysis or things like that, where it's more engaging for them and they have a much higher satisfaction with and feeling about how they're contributing to the company. So the turnover in AP has historically been pretty high. It's probably second only to a call center. And you can really dramatically lower that with automation and make your employees feel more engaged in the business while processing invoices at a much quicker time and really speeding up close and everything else that a CFO is looking for.
Yeah, that time savings is huge
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
one of the things too, as you were talking about that, I used to work in IT. I've done a lot of different things, and I started thinking about there's manual processes, and then there's processes within computer systems and things like that, where you know, processing an invoice, there's a lot of manual steps along the way, and each one of those steps, quite frankly, is a system.
Hmm.
Even it's not you're not be using the computer on it, but there's still a system. You put the physical invoice in a tray that it gets stamped, entered, coded. So you're doing all of these systems, and it reminds me of when people have to log into 15 different systems to do their job. Oh,
Yeah,
it's soul sucking, and you're like, oh, I cannot do this. So automating these things and like you said, it scans it, it registers it, it pretty much knows how to code it, and it does a pretty good job. And a lot of people say, well, it could make a mistake. And I'm like, what do you think your accounts payable
it,
person's been doing all this time? They look at an invoice and they say, okay, we code this into this code, and they're going to make a mistake, and they may classify it into a different division than it belongs. In all likelihood, the AI, when it comes to a coding type of thing, looking at past events, as long as the past ones were entered correctly, the likelihood of it being correct on classifying this invoice is pretty good.
it
Uh,
is. It is. And I think that's one of those like soft benefits that you get from it is freeing up the employee from, like you said, receiving the invoice, stamping it, putting it in a tray, going over to a scanner, scanning it, and then coming back and saving it, and then starting the coding process. Having the automation actually do all of that for you, and the AI and machine learning pull it off and code it for you actually gives the employee more time to make sure it's coded correctly. Do we want to put it in this department versus this department? They have more time to kind of think through that. The other benefit is they have more time to think about, does this invoice make sense? Is it fraud? Or could it potentially be fraud? And should I dig a little bit deeper? When you're just slammed at month end trying to get close done and get all these invoices processed, you have very little time to stop and think about, does this make sense? So you really do cut down a lot of fraud risk, a lot of coding errors. Every company I've been in that did this manually and printed a check and brought it to me, and put it on my desk. I had to flip through, look at the check, compare it to the invoice amount. Inevitably, there's a fat finger in there somewhere. Humans make mistakes, whereas the machines tend to not make mistakes. Now, it might not be in the account you want or the department you want because you've changed things or whatever. But generally speaking, it's going to be coded correctly. If you're coding the same invoice, if it's Salesforce, just to use a company everybody knows, and it's in the same account every single month, and it's split the same way, the machine learning picks that up and codes it for you. You're never going to have to touch that again. All you're doing then is verifying that it is accurate, and that takes 1 to 2 minutes versus 3 to 4 minutes to manually code it and potentially key in a 4-5 instead of a 5-4. And so I think there's so many benefits to automation that I always tell people, like, get out of the rut you're in. Like, take the time, go look at what's out there as a product. They're not all perfect. They're all getting better. And as AI advances, the software and the products are advancing with it. So, my company, for example, spends a lot of time and energy. We have, I think, 15 different PhD level engineers working on just the AI component to continually make it better. And all of our competitors are doing the same thing to some extent. And so I think the software will get better and better over time. But right now, it's such a huge advance over manually processing. You're doing yourself a disservice by not at least exploring that option.
Of course, and we've already discussed this a little bit, but what are some of the biggest hurdles you see with clients that are trying to go from that manual 1987 accounting system? They've got an old Packard Bell computer that's got Peachtree accounting on it. I'm kind of
Yeah,
I'm dating
yeah.
myself because that's what I was using back in 1987 when I worked in an accounting firm in Waterford, Michigan. Uh,
Yeah.
so it's like, yeah, monochrome screen too. When we got the color screens, man, that was it. I was like, oh,
Oh, yeah.
this is the best. But anyway, I tried my best to convince one of my kids that we didn't have everything in the world was black and white until like
Yeah.
1983. And
Yeah.
it's an ongoing conversation. She doesn't believe me, of course, but I try.
Yeah.
Like, someday maybe she'll buy it. But what's some of the biggest hurdles for companies to like really transition into this digital workflow kind of thing? Because I think, from my assessment, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think they overcomplicate it in their mind what it looks like. It's like it's your workflow. Your workflow is your workflow.
Mhm.
Accounting hasn't changed a whole lot since the Mad Monk came up with it, hundreds and thousands of years ago. So it's pretty much the same. So your workflow is, but it's digital, and sometimes I think people try to overcomplicate it when they try to move from manual processes to a digital one. So what's some of the challenges you see commonly with clients that are migrating over?
I think that's probably the primary one. People think it's going to be more difficult than it's really going to be, or that their custom process can't be built into the software. And I think, most of the AP automation softwares that are out there are very flexible. So if you have a crazy, level of approvals or routing of approvals, most of those can adapt to that. You can set up, if you want, a AP clerk to do the first approval, and then it goes to a, manager, and then it goes to the CFO or the controller. Like, all of those can be built in very, very easily. So I think people tend to think my process is different. At the end of the day, processing an invoice is pretty much the same in almost any company. The approvals change a little bit, the payment, changes a little bit, but other than that, the general process is pretty similar. So most of the AP automation softwares out there are built to accommodate that. So I would say, don't get too twisted around the axle over mine's very complicated. Most of the softwares can accommodate that. I think people also tend to get concerned that this is going to mean I have to let my AP clerks go. I always tell people that I'm talking to, it doesn't. It actually means that you can free them up to do other things that are more value added to your organization. So those types of analysis, looking for fraud, because fraud is just more and more rampant. So you want them freed up to have time to think about, does this invoice make sense? And I haven't seen it before, or AP can or sorry, automation can do a lot of things, and some of that is fraud identification. So a lot of the products out there, including ours, has flags when it looks like something has changed. So if the bank account on the invoice has changed from what it was prior, it'll throw a flag. Hey, go look at this and confirm this is a correct, invoice. They're asking you to change the bank account. So you should call the vendor and make sure. Or the amount is different than it normally is, and things like that, to help you get a handle around fraud. So I think people get concerned that it's going to be too time consuming. It's going to cost me employees. Our process doesn't work. Like, none of those are actually the case. The AP automation softwares that sit out there all sit on top of your current existing accounts payable process, and your ERP, your accounting software. So if you're using NetSuite or Intact or whatever, it lays on top of it, and it's an enhancement to the way their AP works today. So theirs is starting to get more and more automated. Ours are, because we're specialized in just AP automation, you get a lot more services out of somebody using a third party than you will using the native AP, module within one of those ERPs. So I always tell people, yeah, you have that, and you in theory are already paying for it, but you're not getting the full benefit of a true automation software unless you look at something else that's out there in the market, at least at the moment.
Yeah. So what are some things you help people do so they get unstuck on this? Because they know they're like, I need to do this. I know this is important. You've sold me already on, saving 8 to 10 minutes per invoice. And all of a sudden they start dreaming and they're like, oh wow, we could start doing, a lot more of this other stuff that we want to do, or we can scale the business, like you said, without having to hire additional people. Boy, do organizations love that ability. It's like,
Yeah.
oh wow, it's like we can grow, take on more clients and not have to add any staff. And important to me is don't burn them out by doing so as well. It's like, okay, that's a win-win. But, a lot of times they get stuck, if they get that, so,
Yeah.
what's some low-lying fruit that you kind of help people with so they it kind of gets that momentum and they go, okay, yeah, I'm seeing this. I'm buying into this now a little bit more. I believed in it, but now I'm seeing it and I feel it, and I'm ready to really go full bore into it. So what are some things you help people with that?
Yeah, usually it's exactly those things. Like, I'll talk to them about the cost savings that you can get from it. Because if you're a controller or CFO, you're always concerned about the cost and how do I drive more profitability through my business. That's probably, the first bucket to talk to. Then I usually talk to them about the satisfaction of their employees and the turnover they have in their department, how high it's been, and you can cut that down. And the ability to, because of the time savings that AP automation creates, the ability to use them to do those more value added things. And then in almost everyone will, every CFO I talk to is like, if you could have another, quarter of a person as an analyst versus a processor, would that be interesting to you? And they're like, yeah, sure. If I could understand my spend better, understand, have them look at accruals and make sure all the accruals are correct because they have more time in a, condensed close cycle, to look at those things. And I would feel more comfortable and not have to spend as much of my time reviewing the financials. That would be fantastic. And then I think you get to kind of the last one, which is it can also be a revenue generator. And when you hit them with that piece, they're like, okay, now tell me more. You go, look, there's a way to monetize payments, through the use of virtual credit cards, for example, to make those payments, to your vendors. It generates what's called interchange in the back end, which is the fee the merchant pays to accept that card. Um, a lot of companies like us rev share that. And so it can offset either the cost of your other payments, like checks and ACHs, or potentially the cost of your other payments plus the AP automation software itself. And so Yooz, for example, has several customers that get a check from us. So their virtual card spend is enough that the revenue share covers their checks, their ACHs, and the actual software for the AP automation itself. So literally, we cut them a check every month. So they get all the benefits of the time savings, all the employee satisfaction benefits, and they get revenue for it. Um, and when you can kind of walk through that model, AP automation just makes sense. And then, the only other hurdle really to get over is the implementation hassle. And it's always going to be there, right? Like anytime you're installing something new, there's a time frame of that implementation, and it takes a little time and energy and thought, mind share to kind of get that through the process. But once you're done, the benefits on the back end are just so huge. So I tell people, look, don't do it in the first quarter, right? You're doing close, you're trying to get year end close done, you're trying to get your audits done. You have a lot going on, but second, third, fourth quarter are perfect times to, carve off some time for your team. It really won't take that much time, usually about 60 to 90 days to get up and running, and you get all those benefits. So just, investigate what's out there, really think about the benefits for your own organization, both on a cost, savings and potential revenue generation. And it's really hard to come to a conclusion that it doesn't make sense to do.
Yeah, and the fact, that, you're a vendor and all of a sudden there's a rev share component on the virtual cards is obviously unique and different. And also, I thought about it from a kind of a control standpoint as well, because with credit card fraud can be really problematic in a business as well. It's like, okay, what's our credit card being used for to pay for certain things? Because sometimes we're doing ACH, sometimes we're doing check. This one only takes credit card. So you've got all these moving parts. And if you have, the mechanism set up where it's like, okay, we're going to, leverage and utilize, some virtual cards for certain things. And, there's all of that. It all of a sudden it's more controlled. It's not like, okay, here's the MasterCard that's out in somebody's wallet and we just sent them to the office supply store and we don't know if they've used it or not on anything else until we get the bill kind of thing. Where if it's a virtual thing, it's within the accounting system who's the accounts payable person doing it. So as long as they're playing nice in the sandbox, again, it's an additional control thing. But again, like I said, the rev share component of it. I mean, that's, there's not a lot of vendors out there. It's like, yeah, you're going to use our product and service. And oh, by the way, there's this one component of it where, there's some revenue generating opportunities. Yeah, you tell the
Yeah.
CFO, yeah, your expense line items are going to help you generate revenue up here. They're like,
Yeah.
how? What?
Yeah.
They're like, first they look at you like you have three heads, and then they go, wait a minute, what? And all of it. It's
Yeah.
like one of those things. They're already kind of sold on it, and it's like, oh, quoting the late Steve Jobs, one more thing, and
Yeah.
and then you just drop that on them, and then they're
Yeah.
like, take my money, and it makes sense because all of a sudden they're going to make more money,
Yeah.
and they're going to be more efficient. Their accounts payable team and their finance team are going to have time to
Yeah.
do the stuff that they like doing in many cases, which is the analyzing of, okay, here's what we spent. Well, analyze it. Well, why are we spending that? Why are we trending so high? What in they I think a lot of people want to do that, but they just simply don't get the time to. And if they can dig in and all of a sudden they present a report to the CFO, say, did some research on our spend with this, and we're noticing some interesting trends from the West region for some reason. And then you can dig into it. And again, you find it and you go, ooh, that could be problematic, a year or two down the road. Well, let's make some adjustments now. All of a sudden, you've just prevented a potential huge increase in cost because you were able to catch it before it happened.
Yeah.
And boy, oh boy, when you get to do things like that, you can kind of tell I'm pulling back deep into the archives of my accounting brain.
Yeah.
Um, I thought that the Guinness killed all that, but anyway, but it just I get excited about this because what it does is it helps companies become more efficient. It helps companies to be better, and when they are better, that means they can invest more into the products and services that they make, which you and I benefit from as
Yeah.
consumers.
Absolutely, absolutely. You're freeing up those dollars, like you said, to focus on, you can spend that instead of processing invoices, spend those dollars on sales or marketing or something that drives even more revenue. So on top of the revenue share, there's that reallocation of that revenue that you could actually use to drive top line growth. So, it all makes sense. And you touched on something like the beauty of the virtual cards is it's a single use card. So it's preloaded for the amount of the invoice. It's a single use card. So the ability for a fraudster to steal that card and take more money just doesn't even exist. Um, and people forget when you send a paper check, you're sending the routing number and account number to your bank. So if you aren't running debit blocks on your account, for example, someone can in theory, if they have access to a system, start pulling money out of your account fairly easily. And so you really have to watch that. And fraud is just getting worse and worse and worse. So, companies like us are using AI to start combating that fraud. The bad actors are using AI to perpetrate it. So it's going to get more and more sophisticated as AI becomes more mainstream, both on the fraud prevention side and on the fraud side. So I always tell people, look, if you haven't had fraud in your business, it's one of, three things. Like you've had it and you found it, you have it right now and you just haven't found it yet, or you've just been really, really lucky. But otherwise, almost every company I've been in has had some form of AP fraud, whether it's people, faking travel invoices and things like that, or just straight up, bad actors attempting to get you to wire money out of your account or whatever. And so that's just going to accelerate. You really need the ability to free up your people to think about what they're doing and not just think, does that email coming from the CEO telling me to wire money to this bank account make sense? And am I just going to blindly do it? Or do I now have the time to go, wait, this kind of seems weird. Why would he email me? He's down the hall. I'm just going to go ask him. And those are the things that prevent some of those frauds because they're getting better and better with AI. The ability to use someone's face and make their mouth move and use their voice and make it look like a Zoom call is not far off.
No, it's really close, and even to the point when, my mother had passed away last year, but with AI and all that
Mhm.
stuff, and I've used it and cloned my voice for different things to play around with it and whatnot, and it's like, okay, that's really close. So I said, okay,
Yeah,
Mom, here's the situation. I am kind of a public figure,
yeah,
so people can if someone wants to go after me or you or a family member, something like that, they might do this. So I simply just said,
yeah,
okay, we got to come up with a code word. So
yeah,
if you get a call from me saying I need you to wire me something because something happened to something or something like that, ask me what the code word is.
yeah,
And we came up with a goofy word that no one could come up with. So, but it's so easy to do, and that's the frustrating
yeah,
thing. And it's the classic tale of the cat versus the mouse. That war
yeah,
continues. So, John,
yeah.
love this conversation. Where can people find out more about you and this amazing work you're doing?
You can go to getyooz.com, or reach out to me on LinkedIn, either one.
Yeah, I'll definitely have all that in the show notes. So, John, thank you for a very engaging and awesome conversation. Really appreciate you and the work you're doing.
Likewise, thank you very much for having me.